All right, students, we are moving through from major paper number 1, your critical analysis, into major paper number 2 now. As you complete your critical analysis, make sure to pay attention to formatting and any of those other considerations. Remember that you're only required to include one source for major paper number 1. Critical analysis only looks at the source itself. Major paper number 2 is going to move us into synthesis. Synthesis is a process that is kind of philosophical in nature, and I will upload some handouts to sort of clarify how synthesis works, but a basic overview of synthesis is that synthesis consists of the examination of two sources. On examining those two sources, an author should identify unique qualities or characteristics inherent in each source individually. When the author has identified those, he or she will then identify common truths between those two sources and then reflect on how those common truths reconcile a question about those two sources that generalizes the content. Synthesis was invented a couple of hundred years ago by a philosopher named Georg Hegel. Hegel theorized that an ultimate truth could be identified by engaging in synthesis, and this is where the handout will come in. There's a diagram to keep this from being too confusing. But Hegel identified his sources via this process. Thesis number 1 is source number 1. As we've discussed thesis statements, we know that a thesis is sort of a primary idea. So thesis 1 is the first source and the idea that the philosopher or analyst extracts from that source. The analyst will identify specific characteristics or qualities of that source before moving on to thesis number 2, which is referred to as the antithesis, which is the opposing thesis to thesis number 1. So, for example, our thesis number 1 could be something to the effect that all fish must breathe water from underwater in order to survive. So we will find some kind of scientific document that supports that and identify all of the information therein. Thesis number 2 may take a completely opposing perspective, such as fish exist that have rudimentary lungs that can breathe air in order to survive. So it can be completely opposite, and then we'll identify what makes that source credible and characterizes it. Section number 3 is called synthesis, where it's important to understand in synthesis that you're not choosing a winner or a loser. What you're doing is identifying that both have valid claims and therefore neither one can win, so you have to reconcile them. So our common truths between those two sources are that fish do need to breathe to survive, and fish spend most of their time in water. But synthesis is going to say, well, there are fish that can breathe outside of water, but not all fish can breathe outside of water. So our synthesis might be something to the effect that in the animal kingdom, it is rare to find a fish that can breathe out of water, but that does happen. Therefore, not all fish must be underwater in order to breathe. It's a pretty lame example, and you will likely encounter much better examples as you start researching this and maybe get a better understanding with the diagrams. But in a nutshell, synthesis looks at two sources and tries to make a compromise between the ideas. The ideas may be completely opposite, or they may kind of fall into line with one another. So synthesis is not just looking for completely opposite perspectives. Sometimes synthesis occurs between sources that have very similar perspectives, but some kind of unique difference. Another thing to keep in mind is that synthesis is not compare and contrast. We are not identifying what's similar and what's different about these sources. When we write a synthesis paper or perform synthesis, what we're doing is looking at each source individually and reconciling that one completely before we move on to the other source. Once both of those sources have been examined, common truths are identified, but we skip over the contrast part and start trying to compromise them. The second paper for this course is going to focus on two sources, like I mentioned. I'm going to be kind of reading through the rubric, so some of this may be a little bit redundant based on what I've already said. But synthesis is the process of taking elements from multiple sources and integrating them into a single original idea. The goal of synthesis is to identify distinct elements in each source and then to reflect on how those elements influence your own understanding of a concept. For the purpose of this paper, we're going to be working with the concept of love. There will be a few other lectures, like I mentioned, as well as a couple handouts that you can look over to kind of clarify this idea. But source number one for this paper is going to be the song Jesse's Girl. I'm going to provide a link to a YouTube video for that so that you can listen to it. You may need to look up the lyrics too if necessary, but you'll receive the works cited information for Jesse's Girl. Source number two is any source of your choice. What you're going to be examining in each source is the approach by which the main character or the narrator or singer, so with your sources you can choose a film, a TV show, you can choose a book, you can choose a song. Any source, any format is completely open. So you can choose anything you want out there. But how does that main character, that narrator, or that singer attempt to gain the affection of someone else? The song Jesse's Girl, for those of you who haven't heard it, and I'm sure some of you may not recognize it by name, but I'm sure once you hear it, you'll remember it. The song is about somebody who is trying to get the affection of a girl who loves somebody else, and he kind of goes through the motions of trying to figure out or troubleshoot his approach to it. And so what you're going to do is look at that and explain how he's going through, how he's going about this, and whether he's doing it right, whether he's doing it wrong. You're welcome to reflect on that. Then in your second source, your antithesis, that character, narrator, or singer is going about it through a different way. So you're going to identify what's unique about his or her approach to getting the affection of somebody else. Once you get to the synthesis portion, you're going to reflect on how normal people go about the process of getting another person's affections. You're not choosing if somebody was doing it right or doing it wrong and identifying a winner, but what do they have in common? Obviously, the first thing they have in common is both of the characters that we've got from source number one and source number two are in love with somebody else. Both of them are trying to get somebody else's affections, and what you're trying to accomplish is explaining how a normal person would do that. You know, identify what you think is maybe not appropriate or not the smartest move. You might find this sort of a humorous paper to write. You might find it more of a serious paper to write, depending on what your perspective on love is and normal behavior in a relationship. But the synthesis portion is going to reflect on that and sort of compromise on it. You know, maybe it's not quite normal to write an entire song about how you're desperately in love with somebody. Maybe it's better to just walk up to that person and say, hey, I think you're kind of cute. Would you like to get a drink sometime or something like that, you know? So grading is going to be based on the following. Thesis statement is going to be required, of course. 15% of the grade will come from that. Papers will include a complete thesis statement that incorporates an idea of your synthesis of the two sources. Synthesis of the sources can be whatever your final conclusion is on looking at these two sources. So keep in mind that a thesis statement doesn't always have to be written first. You may get an entire paper written and then go back and determine what your thesis statement is. That is totally relevant and valid to do. We're not incorporating a critical approach in this paper, so the method portion of the SAMI formula is not going to factor in. So you're going to have a subject or subjects, obviously, an action, and an intent. So this paper is going to analyze, we've got action, Jesse's Girl and source number 2 for the purpose of explaining how a normal person might go about asking somebody out or something like that. That's a sort of generic simplified version of a thesis statement, but that's the sort of formula that it's going to follow. Content of the paper is going to count for 25% of the paper grade. So the paper should devote a substantial portion of their length to examining the narrator or singer or character's motives, as well as his and her techniques. So what is the character trying to do? Obviously, get the girl or get the guy or other. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's an old joke from Seinfeld. As well as the techniques. It's not just what the motives are. We all know that the character is trying to get somebody else's attention, but how do they go about doing that? When you pay attention to Jesse's Girl, you'll get a good understanding of what the singer's technique is. Write the paper in sections. So don't jump back and forth between source number 1 and source number 2. They need to be looked at in sort of a self-contained section for each. A good format for organizing the paper would be your intro, get your thesis statement out of the way, explain what you're trying to do, then analyze source number 1 completely, then move to source number 2 and analyze that completely before moving to a synthesis and reflection section. So once you get both of those out of the way, start identifying those commentaries. Both of these guys are trying to get the girl. However, one goes about it in a much more well-adjusted way than the other or something like that. And then finally, your conclusion. Okay. Length of the paper is going to count for 30% of the grade. This time, papers are going to be 5 pages long instead of 4 for the critical analysis, and there will be an additional works cited page included. So 5 pages plus a works cited page. Formatting. 15% of the paper is going to be formatting. So follow the appropriate formatting guidelines for your chosen paper format. MLA should be your default. I have mentioned before that APA will be accepted, but practice using MLA if you're going into a field that uses that. If you're going into science or psychology, APA is acceptable. I can grade both. MLA is just preferred. Finally, a works cited page needs to be included. That's going to be 15% of the grade, so make sure it's correctly formatted, but it also must be included with the paper for the paper to receive credit. Papers that do not include a works cited page on submission will be counted late until one is provided. So if you submit it and it doesn't have a works cited page, you will receive a letter grade deduction per day until you email me that works cited page. So if there's any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm going to post up this video, the rubric for this paper, and this song. I'm going to get a diagram together for how synthesis should work and type up a little handout for that. But I mainly want you to finish up this critical analysis paper that's due by midnight tonight. Uh, get a listen to this song and start thinking about developing a thesis. On Tuesday, we'll get a little bit deeper into everything else related to this paper. So I want to give you more time to focus on the critical analysis before jumping into this next one. So as always, any questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, just work at the pace that's comfortable for you. Thanks.